Hey, what's going on? Back here with you today of another episode of the Culmination Project podcast. I'm your host, Cole Blackburn. Love doing that. Anyways, this is actually my first, well, not my first podcast, but first time back doing it. I kind of started a couple times. It's one of those things that it just keeps calling me, and I'll never live it down, and I'll regret it if I don't carry out this podcast, because it's something that naturally wants to arise and come out of me, which is the whole idea and premise of the podcast and the things that I speak about on my Instagram, on Twitter, on YouTube. So as many of you know, that I do a lot of writing, especially on Twitter, and that's something also that is just natural for me. It kind of always has been. Even since I was a kid, I always leaned more into writing versus mathematics or any kind of sciences. But what I want to speak to you about today has to do with drugs. So as some of you know, I have had quite the journey with different types of drug use. And there have been some things about it that have massively benefited me to get to where I am now, and to have a lot of the realizations that I'm currently having and have been having for a while, and to, in essence, speed up this maturity of what I would call spiritual self-development, personal type awakening, the awakening at the level of mind, body, spirit, emotions, meaning it's mostly a clearing out of a lot of junk and layers of garbage that we've been fed by society and the people around us, not even through any fault of their own, just because that's what they were fed, and that's what the people before them were fed, and before that, and before that, and it just goes on and on and on. And so really, so much of what I speak about comes down to the individual, because that's really at the end of the day, and the beginning of the day, as I like to say, the end all be all to actual group change and to influencing the population and reality at large. Because without the individual changing, we have no hope. We're just running around trying to put out fires, essentially. And in order for the individual to change, it cannot be any kind, at least from my view, from what I've experienced, there's no forcing it. There's no real strategy to it. I mean, there are things technically that you can do, which brings me to one of my favorite quotes, spiritual quotes, which is, enlightenment or spiritual awakening is not something you can make happen. It's almost like a cosmic accident, but there are things you can do to make yourself accident prone. So the essence behind that idea is that you can't force anything. It has to come and arise naturally. But at the same time, paradoxically, if you do nothing, if you sit around, drinking beer all day, or going to the club, or hanging around people that are not good for you, the odds of that awakening happening on at least speeding up, because it will eventually happen. You'll learn through trial and error, but the odds of it speeding up by listening to these intuitions that you're having and moving away from, say, going out to the bars or hanging out with people who are fair weather friends that don't really align with you anymore. Maybe they align with an old part of you. But the idea behind that is that it sort of naturally happens and matures on its own through a continued examination of just what works and what does not. So a continued examination of what continues to cause resistance and pain and suffering in a person's life versus what makes someone feel lighter, what gives the aha moments, what is able to, in essence, make a person see that the things they're believing about themselves, about the world, about others, is all about trying to control, trying to chase, trying to project outward to find fulfillment, when that is just absolutely not the way to do it, other than the fact that doing that enough will eventually lead you to the realization that maybe I'm going about this the wrong way. Maybe I'm actually doing it backward, which is what probably 99% of the population is doing in some fashion or another. Some more than others. Some have a much lighter, sense of conditioning, sense of egoic self, sense of wanting to control, and others have a very dense version that is constantly in turmoil, constantly afraid, constantly having anxiety, constantly out for themselves, self-centered, and everything in between. So that's what you might call the spectrum of the maybe sub-lucid state. Some people are really much more lucid. Some people are super asleep at the wheel. So back to the drug comment, to get back to that particular subject, because I did say, I promise you we're going to talk about that. So how it's impacted me and how I see substances, whether, obviously there's different classes of them, but let's just take the ones for me personally that really, on one hand, made this a really hard process and took a long time, years, 10, 15 years, for me to actually start to wake up to this whole other way of perceiving life that was right in front of me the whole time. But it wasn't through like psychedelics or through some sort of insight type of drug. It was more through pain and suffering. So back in the day, I used to be addicted to opiates when I was in, my senior year of high school, all the way through my mid-20s. I'm currently 37, so do the math. But what happened is I went to rehab a couple times, did a couple stints there, and every time I would get off of these substances, off of these opiates, and stop partying and get clear out my system, clear out my body, clear my mind, get some time and space and silence, really, start to introspect, start to look at myself. When I would do that, this whole other perception would open up. In addiction recovery, some people will call it the pink cloud, but it was more than that even for me. It's literally like when I would drop the drugs and get healthy, a lot of my mind and my mental chatter and fear and anxiety would drop. And because that dropped, I was much more present in the moment with life. And so it opened up this world where it was very ungrounded, but it was this like very impactful, very explosive type of awakening experience where I was just in a flow state for 6 months at a time. A couple of them lasted about 6 months. And eventually it would close down. And so the point of me telling you this is because it's almost like, whether it's through psychedelics and you have some awakening experience, because I know a lot of people have that, but then they get addicted to the psychedelic or to the weed or to whatever. Say I had the same thing with marijuana, it would open me up to all these insights, when I was younger. But eventually it's almost like it's showing you what is possible. It's giving you a glimpse at what can be perceived and what can be lived and embodied without any of those things. And then it's shutting it back down. So it gives you this little window. It says, it opens this door. It says, hey, look at this. This is the way you can perceive life. and it can be in a flow, and it can be beautiful, and you're connected to that inner authenticity, to that inner movement, to that inner still small voice. Some people call it God, some people call it universe, some people call it love, some people call it, consciousness. It's that unknown piece that doesn't really ever tell you why. It's disconnected from the logical mind usually. It's more just like, if it were to say something, it would be just like, follow me, listen. It lights up. It gives you a great feeling whenever you're doing something that you're super interested in, or you meet somebody you just resonate with, you connect with them on a whole nother level, for really no reason other than just their presence. And so what it does is drugs can open that up. So in my case, it was just a lot of really having that closed down and stuffed down because of the substances that I was taking in particular. And then when I would stop taking them, that would open up. And I just literally would want to float along, talk to random strangers, commune with nature. And I was like, what is this? What is this state? And I had to know more. And then as things go, when you're in that flow state, lots of synchronicities start to happen. Coincidences, which is actually a positive word, coincide. Things start to coincide. You meet the right people, you're in the right situations. In this case, the right books would come to me at the right time, kind of defining or showing me that, hey, this is an actual possible way to live that can be developed and cultivated and can mature over time. And so my opinion on drugs from a general standpoint is they give you that gift. They say, hey, here's what's possible. But then the issue is people get hooked on the crutch. When eventually you just see, you're like, oh, this is possible. And that doesn't mean you never use them again, or, a lot of people nowadays, if they're doing it in a wise way, they're using them in a very intentional setting, occasionally, when it feels connected with that inner calling, with that inner intuitive voice, when that says, hey, let's do this, have this experience, because I have something to show you. And a lot of times when it's done in that way, at least from my experience and from what I've heard speaking to others, that can actually be very beneficial, very therapeutic, very useful to open people up and help remove some of these layers of conditioning, of belief, of old pattern, old habits that are layered on top and blocking that inner voice from coming forward and from being at the forefront of your life and from really taking up what I like to call taking up residency in the human form, in the human system. And that can be very valuable. And even the haphazard way that I did it, that I chose to go about it, it still worked out for me. So on the one hand, you can't screw it up. You can't mess this journey up. But what you can do is make it really difficult and really painful for yourself. And sometimes that's just what you need. Sometimes we just need to have our backs against the wall, which is what happened to me and is what has happened to me throughout my life. Even though at the age I'm at now, I've wised up and finally started to say, I get it. I understand now. And so the gaps between when I get out of alignment, when I get out of touch with that inner space, have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, to where once I start to veer off course a little bit, I can course correct super fast without it being too painful. Because the more, you'll notice, the more self-aware you become, the more cleared out you become, the more connected with spirit, with intuition, with that dynamic state of consciousness you become, the more painful it instantly is whenever you get out of alignment with that. So that's what I have to say about drugs. Use them at your own risk. Do your best to be intentional about them. Do your best to ask, really dig deep and ask if it's the right time to use them, the right way to use them, or don't. Go to the school of hard knocks like I did. Sometimes that's what people need in order to, actually I'd say often, that's what people tend to go. So just know, eventually you'll get there. Eventually this will dawn on you, and that fine-tuning, that development of this sense of almost otherworldliness, which is really just your natural state, it's your organic state, it's your deprogrammed state. It's like setting a computer back to factory settings. It's the state where you're able to actually think clearest and see the direction that you're supposed to go in life. You're able to connect with the things that are really genuine and authentic for you. But sometimes that takes a little while to get back to it, depending on the level of societal conditioning we've had, depending on the family we grew up in, depending on who our friends are, depending on, a lot of times it just depends on the person's personality and how they're hooked up naturally. So that's what I got for you guys today. Thanks for checking the show out. I will see you next time. Have an amazing rest of your whatever time of the day it is for you. Peace.